1 week after we moved into our new home, my phone rang at 9:17 p.m. The man on the line didn't introduce himself. He didn't ask how I was settling in. He just said, "I forgot to disconnect the living room camera." Then he paused, long enough for my stomach to drop. "Claire, I am incredibly sorry to intrude like this. I was just about to delete the old security app from my phone when it pinged with a motion alert in your living room. I thought it might be a break-in, so I opened the feed. But what I saw, your father and your brother were forging documents right on your dining table. I've saved the footage for you before I officially hand over the account credentials. I saw what your father and your brother did while you were on base," he continued. I stood in my kitchen, the phone still warm against my ear. My husband was in the living room, and the sound of cardboard boxes being folded was the steady, rhythmic pulse of a life I thought was finally safe. But the world had just tilted. Gary, the previous owner, a man in his late 50s who had seemed so relieved to be done with this house, had just handed me a weapon I didn't even know I needed. Years of working as a customs agent had trained me for moments exactly like this. When a breach occurs, you don't panic. You contain the damage. You assess the threat. Then you neutralize it. Before we dive into how I dismantled their scheme, I'd love to know who is joining me today. Drop a comment with where you're listening from. It's always a reminder that no one has to face these battles alone. I didn't cry. I didn't demand answers from the empty air. Anger wasn't loud this time. It was clinical, like a balance sheet that wouldn't settle. My father, Jonathan, and my brother, Tyler, the people I had been the silent investor for since I turned 18, had finally, irrevocably, overdrawn their account of my loyalty. I grabbed my keys and left a note for my husband. It was something vague about a late-night call from the port. It was a lie. But in my line of work, you learn that the first report is never the full picture. I met Gary at a 24-hour diner on the edge of Charleston. The smell of burnt coffee, an industrial floor cleaner, felt more honest than the rot I was about to witness. Gary looked like he hadn't slept in days. He slid a tablet across the laminate table, his hands shaking, just enough to be noticeable. He didn't say a word. He didn't have to. The video loaded with a grainy hum. There they were. My father, 62 years old, and my younger brother, 28. They were standing in my new living room, the very space where I had planned to host our first family Thanksgiving. Jonathan was holding a manila folder, his posture stiff, with a false sense of authority. Tyler was lounging in my new armchair, a smirk on his face that I had spent 22 years funding. "She won't know," Tyler said, his voice clear through the speaker. "She's at the border for another 3 weeks. By the time she checks the title, the funds will be moved." My father hesitated. For a heartbeat, a flicker of what I hoped was guilt. But it was just greed. $180,000 is a lot to pay back, Tyler, he muttered. My brother laughed, a sharp sound that cut through the diner's quiet. "It's not a loan, Dad. It's an inheritance advance. She's strong. She'll recover." I watched my father sign my name. He didn't even hesitate. He traced the loops of my signature with the precision of a man who had practiced for this. They were borrowing $180,000 against the equity of my home to cover Tyler's gambling debts. Tyler even mentioned a $45,000 broker fee he was keeping for himself for arranging the private lender. I closed the laptop and handed it back to Gary. I didn't feel broken. I felt sharpened. My compassion for them had been a luxury they had exploited for years. And tonight, I was filing for bankruptcy on their version of family. This wasn't revenge. It was accounting. I sat in my car in the dark parking lot and opened my laptop. I didn't call them. I didn't send a single angry text. Instead, I logged into our shared bank accounts. I changed every password. I revoked my father's access to my emergency power of attorney. I placed a fraud alert on my credit and flagged the pending mortgage application with a breach of security notice. They weren't shocked by what they'd done. They were only going to be shocked that I'd stopped playing along. By the time the sun started to rise over the harbour, my laptop glowed with a different kind of sunrise, the kind made of facts, numbers, and quiet retribution. I walked through the empty rooms of my new house later that morning, the floorboards echoing with a hollow sound that matched the space in my chest. For 32 years, I had been the reliable one, the daughter whose accomplishments were only celebrated because they provided a safety net for everyone else. Now I realized my role hadn't been a daughter or a sister. It was a resource they had been strip mining for decades. I remembered when I was 10 and Tyler was 6. I had saved my allowance for months to buy a specialized science kit. When I finally brought it home, Tyler threw a tantrum because he wanted a new video game. My father, Jonathan, didn't tell him to wait. He took my science kit back to the store and used the refund to buy Tyler's game. "You're smart, Claire," he told me with that practiced smile. "You don't need a kit to be successful. Tyler needs the win. Family helps family." That became the policy. My strength was never my own. It was an asset to be distributed among the weaker members. When I joined the customs agency, my father's emergencies began. There were medical bills insurance supposedly didn't cover, and property taxes on his house that were suddenly due. I never asked for the money back. I thought I was buying love. Now, I realized it had been a subscription, with me footing the bill, while they enjoyed the service. The psychological mechanism behind their cruelty was actually quite simple. In my line of work, we call it a systemic breach, but in psychology, it's the trap of normalized cruelty. My father didn't see himself as a thief. He saw himself as a redistributor of wealth. Because I was strong, they believed I had an infinite capacity to absorb loss. They had spent years normalizing the idea that my survival was guaranteed, which meant my resources were essentially theirs for the taking. To them, stealing $180,000 wasn't a crime. It was a withdrawal from an account they felt entitled to manage. A text from my father popped up at 2 p.m. "Claire, Tyler told me you're having some trouble with the accounts. Let's talk it out like a family." I didn't reply. I was busy watching the digital walls I'd built around my finances hold firm. Then, Tyler called. I let it ring 3 times, before picking up, keeping my recorder running. "What is your problem, Claire?" Tyler didn't say hello. He went straight to the attack. "I put in weeks of work to get that $180,000 line of credit for you. Now, you've frozen everything? I have bills to pay. That $45,000 profit is mine. I earned it by managing the deal. While you were playing soldier at the border." I leaned back in my office chair, staring at the Charleston harbor. My grip on the phone was loose, my pulse steady. I never asked for a loan, Tyler, and I certainly didn't authorize my signature on a mortgage application. Tyler scoffed, his voice dripping with practiced gaslighting. "See? This is what that border duty does to you. You come back and you think everyone is a criminal. Dad was trying to protect your future. We're family. We share the load. You've become so cold, so transactional. It's pathetic. You're sitting on all that equity while the rest of us struggle to keep our heads above water." He wasn't shocked by what he'd done. He was only shocked that I'd stopped being his personal vault. I didn't argue. I didn't try to explain the concept of identity theft to a man who saw crime as a family favor. I simply told him I was willing to meet, to straighten out the paperwork so he could get his money. I could practically hear his greed salivating through the phone. I called Julia, a specialized attorney who understood that in cases like this, blood wasn't thicker than water, it was just a biological excuse for theft. We met in a glass-walled office, overlooking the historic district. She didn't offer me platitudes. She offered me evidence. "The signatures on the mortgage are forged, Claire," Julia said, sliding a folder across her desk. "They didn't go through a traditional bank. That would have taken months. Instead, they targeted a predatory private lender, a hard money firm specializing in high-interest bridge loans. These lenders only care about collateral. They promised a 14-day payout because they had your house as a backstop and a forged signature from a federal agent to greenlight the risk. But they didn't just stop at the house. My investigators found a second filing. Tyler used your name to secure a high-interest private loan, using your mother's heritage jewelry as collateral. He's already pocketed $45,000 of that as a management fee. They've turned your entire life into a liquidation sale." I rubbed my eyes, trying to summon a single ounce of regret, but there was only clarity. This wasn't a family crisis. It was a hostile takeover. Julia drafted a formal notice, but we didn't serve it at my father's house. I wanted them on neutral ground. Invite them to the title office at the municipal building, Julia suggested. Tell them you're there to sign over the final release for the $180,000. We need them in a place where the records are official and the cameras are everywhere. I sent the text to the family group chat, meeting at the municipal building Thursday at 10 a.m. to finalize the paperwork. Be there if you want the money. Jonathan hearted the message within seconds. Tyler followed with an, "About time, sis." The day before the meeting, Julia called me back into her office. She didn't look like an attorney anymore. She looked like an executioner. "It's worse than the jewelry in the house, Claire," she said, her voice dropping into that low frequency reserved for news that changes your life permanently. "Tyler had broken into your home office, stealing copies of the sensitive financial records and personal identity information you use to maintain your federal security clearance. He didn't just steal money. He hijacked your professional reputation. He used your credentials to vouch for his shady transactions, tricking the monitoring systems into thinking this was the legitimate income of a government employee. He had established a shell company named Low Country Logistics and listed me as the sole owner and chief executive officer. My digital signature had been forged on documents that authorized the movement of nearly $300,000 over the last 6 months. It wasn't just gambling debt. Tyler was laundering money for a private lending group to clear his losses. And because my name was on the charter, I was the one the government would come for when the audit hit. I was the one who would be led away in handcuffs, while Tyler enjoyed his $45,000 fee. I stared at the witness line on the incorporation papers. There it was, my father's signature. Jonathan hadn't just turned a blind eye to Tyler's greed. He had actively participated in a scheme that could land me in a federal penitentiary for 20 years. He knew the risks. He understood my job required a clean record. Yet, he had signed that paper, effectively offering my freedom as a sacrifice to keep his favorite son from facing the consequences of his own choices. This was the lethal discovery. This was the moment the bridge was not just burned, but atomized. You don't negotiate with people who are willing to trade your life for their comfort. They hadn't just overdrafted my bank account, they had targeted my future and pulled the trigger. They had transformed our biological bond into a death warrant. I looked at Julia and told her to loop in the federal investigators I knew at the Bureau. If they wanted a federal case, I was going to give them one. The municipal building was a maze of grey hallways and the sharp smell of industrial floor wax, a sterile environment that suited the clinical precision of my plan. I arrived early, flanked by Julia. The federal agents weren't sitting in the room with us. They were in a black SUV, parked down the street, headsets on, monitoring every word through the wire I was wearing. This wasn't just a meeting, it was a sting operation. My pulse was a steady 60 beats per minute. I wasn't here as a daughter. I was the bait in a federal trap. Jonathan and Tyler walked in 5 minutes late. Tyler was wearing a designer shirt that probably cost $600, likely paid for with the management fee he had stolen from my heritage. He looked smug, leaning back in his chair, with the easy confidence of a man who thought he was minutes away from a windfall. My father followed, adjusting his tie and trying to project the image of the protective patriarch. He actually had the audacity to smile at me. "Glad we could settle this, Claire," he said. "Family should always handle things internally." I didn't smile back. I looked at Julia, who placed a tablet in the center of the table, and hit play. The footage from Gary's living room filled the room. The audio was crisp. They watched themselves discuss my recovery and the inheritance advance. They heard Tyler laugh about me being always on base and saw my father's steady hand forge my signature. The silence that followed was heavy enough to crush the lungs. Jonathan's face turned from a flush of greed to a sickly, ashen grey. Tyler's bravado drained instantly, his foot starting a frantic, nervous tap under the table. "You were spying on us?" Jonathan whispered, his voice cracking like dry parchment. I looked at him with the same detachment I used for scanning a suspicious shipping manifest. "I wasn't spying," I replied, my voice calm, factual, and lethal. "I was securing my property. You were the ones who decided to perform a crime in my living room. Suddenly, the mask of the patriarch disintegrated. My father slumped in his chair, then slid out of it, until he was kneeling on the linoleum floor. Claire, please, he begged, his eyes wet with a performance I no longer believed in. Think of the family name. Think of our honor. We'll pay it back. Don't destroy your brother over a mistake. He's all I have left. Looking at him quivering on the floor, I realized the absolute truth of his existence. This was the illusion of power from an empty wallet. For my entire adult life, Jonathan had acted like the pillar of the family, but that position had been a luxury he had been renting with my money. He wasn't a leader. He was a tenant in a life he couldn't afford without me. Without my resources to prop up his ego, he wasn't a father. He was just an accomplice to a fraud. Tyler didn't beg. He snapped, his face contorting with a feral rage. You think you're so much better than us because of that badge? You're a traitor to your own blood. I didn't flinch. I pushed a manila folder across the table toward them. Inside were the federal summons for money laundering and a notice of immediate seizure for the assets Tyler had hidden in low-country logistics. I already did something for the family, I said, my tone as cold as a Charleston winter. I stopped the rot. The rest is in the hands of the United States Attorney. I stood up and walked toward the door. The sound of my father's sobbing was just background noise. They weren't shocked by their betrayal. They were only shocked that I had finally stopped footing the bill for it. The legal battle ended decisively. The unauthorized $180,000 mortgage was officially voided, and the heritage jewelry, those emerald earrings, and the gold necklace my mother had worn on her wedding day was returned to its rightful place in my safe. Jonathan and Tyler didn't end up in orange jumpsuits, but their names were permanently added to a federal registry for financial fraud, and their reputations in Charleston were effectively liquidated. Tyler was forced to pay back every cent of the $45,000 he had pocketed as a management fee, a debt that would take him a lifetime to clear. I stood on the balcony of my house, overlooking the Charleston harbor, the early morning sun painting the water in shades of bruised purple and gold. The salt air felt different now. It wasn't heavy with the humidity of a buried secret, but light with the clarity of a fresh start. For 32 years, I had been the reliable daughter, the one who apologized for her own success so that others wouldn't feel small. But that version of me died in that windowless conference room. I realized then that letting go of blood ties wasn't an act of cruelty. It was an act of survival. DNA is just a blueprint, but family is a contract of mutual respect and protection. When they forged my signature, they breached that contract permanently. Cutting them out was like finally removing a piece of shrapnel I'd been carrying since childhood. The initial pull was painful, but the relief that followed was absolute. With Julia's help, I used the restitution funds to establish the Lawson Legal Defense Fund. It's a foundation dedicated to providing pro bono legal counsel to service members whose finances are compromised while they are on deployment or stationed at the border. I didn't want my story to end with just a closed bank account. I wanted to build something that would protect the next person who is always on base and unable to see the betrayal happening in their own living room. This house is finally quiet. The floorboards still creak, and the fresh paint still lingers in the air, but the ghosts are gone. I don't need a hidden camera to watch my back anymore, because I've finally learned how to defend my own boundaries. I am no longer a line item on someone else's balance sheet. I am a woman who found her worth, not in their approval, but in her own truth. If this story stirred something in you, if it reminded you of a moment when trust was tested or a line was crossed, please share your thoughts in the comments and tell me where you're listening from. We tell these stories so none of us has to carry them alone. We have many more stories to share, real, human, and hard ones. So, if you'd like to keep walking this path with us, subscribe and stay for the next one. Let's keep going together.